Hey everyone, not sure if people can hear me, but just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll get going on all things plugins. Okay, if you've any questions throughout this, please do feel free to put them in the chat. More than happy to answer, and I'll try and reserve some time at the end to go through that. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so today we're talking about Bubble plugins and specifically choosing the right plugins for your app. So before I get into all that, my name is Alex. I run Cranford Tech, which is a Bubble plugins business. Just give a bit of background. I came to Bubble through a bit of a non-traditional background, probably like a lot of people who came across Bubble. I actually worked in finance for the first 7 years of my career, and back in 2020, I was trying to build a startup, which was an online marketplace for music lessons here in Ireland. And I remember I was trying to get this WordPress dev to put together something for me, and it was just a nightmare. I just couldn't do it. We had so many issues. And then I came across a Matt Neary tutorial on YouTube on how to build a marketplace app with no code. And that's really where it started. Devoured that, started rebuilding my app in Bubble, was amazed by what I could do. And yeah, that's where it all started. The startup fizzled out, but back in 2022, I started building Bubble plugins. So I'd be kind of aware of like the Shopify app ecosystem and the WordPress plugin ecosystem. And I saw the Bubble plugin marketplace was still pretty new at that time. And I wanted to dive in. Just as a side note, I'm really jealous of anyone who is starting off building plugins at the moment, because back in 2022, there was so less resources available, even though it only was 2 years ago. And there wasn't also those AI models that we have today. So there was no chat GPT, or at least it wasn't kind of prevalent, or there wasn't any Claude. And I really think they make it much easier to start building plugins in Bubble. You still got to get a grips with the kind of infrastructure around the different actions and all that. But yeah, it's a good time if you are interested in building Bubble plugins to get started with it. So some of our plugins, you may or may not have heard of some of the Cranford Tech plugins. I can just see a few people have joined. Like I said, if you missed it, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do feel free to put them in the chat. But maybe just some of our plugins. So some of our more popular ones include PDF Potion, which is the most powerful way to create PDFs in Bubble. It's a real purpose-built solution for PDF generation in Bubble. Our Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin is one of the plugins with the highest number of 5-star ratings on the Bubble Marketplace, and it's the easiest way to get up and running with payments in your Marketplace app. Our Beautiful Maps Mapbox plugin allows you to build beautiful interactive maps just like this. Our A+ Onboarding Product Tour plugin allows you to introduce users to your app in style. And we have a couple of other plugins as well. For example, the Universal Video Player for videos, Simple Slider Input, a few other ones. But that's kind of a rundown of the greatest hits in terms of the Cranford Tech plugins at the moment. So you might have heard this expression, money makes the world go round. And you could argue whether or not that's true. But what I definitely think is true is that plugins make up the Bubble world go around. Because I've seen so many apps over the past, 3 to 4 years as I've been involved in the Bubble ecosystem, and any production app that's built on Bubble, it usually has at least 5 or 10 plugins in it. And I've actually seen plugins that have, up to 100 plugins. So, sorry, I've also seen apps that have up to 100 plugins. So they really are key in building out applications. I'm just going to check something real quick. You can see a few more people have joined. This session should be recorded. I can see someone's asked. So yeah, if you do want to rewatch that at a later time, you should be able to do so. But I actually always kind of guessed that, all production apps built on Bubble used, a serious amount of plugins, but I never really had any kind of firm numbers behind that. So over the past kind of week or so, I did a little study of my own where I looked at 1,600 live Bubble apps. So they're in production, they're being used by people. And I was able to work out that on average, they're using 15 plugins. And that's the average. Some, of course, will be using less, but there was a lot that were using a lot more, including one or two that I mentioned had over 100 plugins being used in them. And I think the plugins are like such an advantage if you're building an app on Bubble. There's currently over 5,000 plugins available in the Bubble marketplace. It's growing every month. And it's a real plus for Bubble as a platform because some of these other no-code platforms, they just don't have the same kind of depth of extensions, whether they're called plugins or add-ons or extensions that Bubble do. And it really allows you to extend the functionality of your Bubble app by so much just by accessing this big marketplace. But this also comes with some downsides. So it's fantastic that we can do so many things with Bubble because of all the plugins, but you need to be careful because there's some issues with just installing the first plugin you see or a plugin that you haven't really researched. And a classic example is something like this. So you install a paid plugin in your Bubble app, and maybe it's doing the job okay. Maybe you've got it up and running for at least one use case, and you've handed the app off to your client. And then a month or two later, you get a message from your client saying, what's this weird error message I'm getting? You do some digging and you figure out that it's related to one of the plugins you've installed. And that happens, if things aren't set up correctly, or maybe Bubble has changed something on their end, that can affect plugins. But you reach out to the plugin creator and they're just not available. They're gone off the farm, they're no longer involved. That can be a real problem. So what I'm going to do later on is just kind of give you some tips on how to find plugins that the risk of this happening is a bit lower. So you can kind of reduce the odds of something like this happening where you're posting on the forum frantically, just looking for some help, but not able to find it. And it's not just, plugin creators who don't support. There's also just things that happen in the Bubble plugin ecosystem that can affect how you manage your plugins. So this slide here, this is actually from a report we put together at the start of this year. It was a Bubble plugin 2023 report. If you go to cranfortech.com and scroll to the very bottom in the footer, there's actually a link to it. You can check it out. But one of the news items that we highlighted were just this API upgrade that happened at the start of 2024. And this was a bit of a tricky one for Bubble to manage. I'm not going to go into the kind of technical details, but essentially AWS made an upgrade on their side, which in turn required a lot of plugin devs who were running server-side actions to upgrade their own plugins. And it wasn't that much work involved in upgrading, but if you weren't paying attention and you didn't make the upgrade, then your plugin got delisted. And it also stopped working if you didn't make the correct changes. So again, this is just something that affected some people. I think most of the most popular plugins that this affected, Bubble did a really good job of reaching out to people with plenty of time. And most of the plugins were upgraded correctly, but it's just a situation you don't want to put yourself in if you're using a plugin that suddenly isn't any longer working. More recently, you may have noticed that some of the plugins now, they come with this little box on the right-hand side here. This is actually quite a new feature, and it's just to explicitly say whether or not plugins are collecting personal data. There definitely was some of this going on in the Bubble marketplace in the past. I don't think it's as kind of mainstream as it once was, but all plugin creators were required some information on this over the past 2 months. And if you didn't do it, your plugin was in danger of getting delisted. So again, if you already had a plugin installed, it wouldn't really have affected you. But if you're looking for a plugin that you've used before and suddenly it's delisted, not an ideal scenario to be in. So again, just a small example of why you really want to be careful with the plugins you choose to install in your app and how you can kind of minimize the risk of something happening that you don't want to. Okay, so when should you use plugins? So my philosophy on when to use plugins is something like this: as much as needed and as little as possible. I think it's incredible what you can add to your Bubble app in terms of, new functionality and connections to other third-party services with plugins. But the reality is, every single time you install a plugin, you're adding an extra dependency. And in most cases, that's going to be fine. But as I just mentioned, there are some reasons you don't really want to add too much more plugins to your app than is strictly necessary. So I mentioned those apps that have over 100 plugins installed. I'd question whether that's necessary. It's going to be adding unnecessary bloat, unnecessary complexity. It's going to slow down the app at a certain level. So just kind of use as much as you need, but not unnecessary. So at the same time. Okay, so you can slice and dice the Bubble plugin marketplace in a number of different ways, but I think there are two broad categories when it comes to plugins, and they are extenders and connectors. So what do I mean by that? When I say extenders, I mean a plugin that allows you to extend the functionality of Bubble within Bubble itself. So maybe just taking a look at the Bubble plugin marketplace. You'll see here, these are the most installed plugins in all of Bubble. You can see Toolbox there, number one. And I think this is a good example of an extender because this allows you to do things in Bubble that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have this plugin installed. In particular with Toolbox, you can run JavaScript, which is obviously a massive thing to be able to do. Another good example of what I'd call an extender is something like the Classify plugin, which allows you to kind of use CSS classes in your Bubble app for styling and for other purposes. Things you can't do natively, excuse me, within Bubble, but with these plugins, you can extend the functionality and it really allows you to take your app to the next level. So that's what I call extenders. I mean, connectors are more things that connect to other third-party services. So for example, if we go on to the next page, you'll see here there's a PayPal checkout plugin that allows you to accept payments via PayPal in your Bubble app. And I consider this more of a connector because you're really kind of explicitly connecting to a third-party service, PayPal in this example. And these are things you can usually do with the API connector. But you may wish to use a plugin, a connector plugin, to save time because you don't want to go setting up every single connection. Maybe you're not comfortable using the API connector for a particular third-party service, or maybe you just kind of need a helping hand in terms of what's the best way to use the service. And most of the good connector plugins, they'll come with details on what calls you should use, how you should interact with the API, and it can just make the whole process a lot easier. So that's kind of how I think about the Bubble plugin marketplace at like a super high level. But I now want to get into the good, the bad, and maybe a bit the controversial when it comes to selecting plugins for your app. So first of all, the good. What am I looking for if I'm, looking at a plugin in one of my own apps? If I want to recommend a plugin to someone else, the number one thing I'm always looking for is activity. So I think the Bubble forum is a fantastic place to judge the health of a plugin. So this is a forum post from Rico's Tip Tap Text Editor plugin, which is an excellent plugin that I would recommend. But what I really like about this plugin is just how active Rico is in updating it and maintaining it, in responding to support requests. So you can see it has over 26,000 views, this forum post. It's been replied to 483 times. And if you click into this thread, you're going to see that Rico is really active in responding to queries and pushing updates. And to me, this is the sign of like a really healthy plugin that has been maintained, that has been developed, and something you can use in your own app without too much worry. Against that, I'm not going to name this plugin, but this was a plugin that was, announced on the forum just under 2 years ago. And you can see there's been pretty much zero activity ever since, or at least there hasn't been any posts on the thread. And this is really where you should be announcing any new features or things like that. So to me, if I see a plugin with, zero replies, very little views, and just not an active kind of creator, that concerns me a bit. I'm going to think twice about installing a plugin like this in my own app. Bubble have redesigned their plugin page recently, and a new feature is if the plugin creator adds a forum thread to their plugin page, it's going to show up here. So you can see for this particular one, there was a forum thread. It's not in every single plugin because sometimes people will just link to documentation. But if there is one of these, I highly recommend checking it out, trying to get a sense of how active the creator is in maintaining the plugin. Okay, so the next one's kind of an obvious one, but I still think it's worth calling out because reviews, reviews, reviews. I think just judging the reviews on a plugin can tell you so much. And you can see here in this example, really positive reviews. This is actually for that classified plugin that I mentioned earlier. And I really like that, there's been a few reviews over the past year or so. They're really positive. One thing I actually would like to see on this is that the plugin creator responds to reviews. So, for example, if you look at the Cranford Tech plugins, you'll see that we respond to every single plugin review, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think it just kind of shows to the reviewers that, look, you are considering their feedback, if there's any negative feedback, and it's just a nice thing to do. But this is good to see. This makes me pretty positive on a plugin. And then, of course, the opposite is something like this, where for this particular plugin, there's been two pretty negative reviews over the past few months. And that can happen, especially if people install a plugin and they're not technical enough to kind of use it fully, or they're not following the documentation. You can get reviews like this. But the big red flag for me in this example is nobody has responded to the reviews. So if someone leaves a bad review on one of the Cranford Tech plugins, we're in there. We're saying, look, what was the situation? Can we help? So bad reviews can happen, but I think you can judge a lot from the plugin creator's reaction or lack of reaction to those reviews. And you're here watching this session, we have a few all right, but like I said, it is recorded, so you can watch it later if you'd like. Okay, so what you don't want is an abandoned plugin. And sometimes this happens with the best of intentions because for most people, bubble plugins are not their main focus. For a lot of people, it's not even their second, third, fourth, or fifth focus. It could be number 9 on a list of 10 priorities. And if you find that a plugin's been abandoned, it's not necessarily through any bad will. It's just it's not that important to the plugin creator in the grand scheme of things, which is completely understandable, but just something you got to be aware of. Okay, so that was kind of the good and the bad. I want to get a bit onto some of the controversial. And the controversial thing is you want to be really wary of plugins that are being sold for like a $3 lifetime license. These do exist, and I get that plugin devs want to make a few sales and get the install count up. But I am really wary of these plugins because if the plugin developer is only charging $3 for a lifetime license, it's very, very difficult for them to justify investing in the plugin in terms of building it, in terms of maintaining it, in terms of adding new features. Whereas if you're charging a more kind of reasonable amount, something like $10 a month, still relatively cheap, then they're going to have a bit more incentive to maintain the plugin. So I would just be very careful about the kind of really cheap plugins. It may work for you, but I just don't think you can count on proper support over the long term. As someone who's built a plugins business, it's just so hard to build anything with that kind of price range. And I think you can kind of divide plugins up into kind of, a few different categories based on price. We have cheap plugins, really cheap plugins, sorry, free plugins, really cheap plugins, and then plugins that actually cost some money. Yes, how about free plugins? Yeah, so I actually have a kind of unusual take on this where I think free plugins, they're fine. I think plugins that actually cost some money are fine, but it's these two ones in the middle here that really make me wary. I consider this the danger zone. And I think a fair question would be, why are you okay with free plugins, but you're not okay with, stuff that costs a bit of money? And the reason is for free plugins, you have access to the source code. So you're probably aware if you have an open source plugin that's free, you can actually see what's going on underneath the hood, and other people can as well. So if you encounter an issue with a free plugin, you can fork it and change it yourself. You can post in the forum and ask for a bit of help. Whereas if we're in this danger zone here of really cheap or even cheap plugins, you don't have that capability. It's all kind of proprietary. Only the plugin dev can see it. They may not be active. So I really think if you're thinking about plugins, you want to be at one of these ends of the spectrum, free or not really, really cheap. And just on open source plugins, I think they're like a really, really underrated source for control, but also for learning. Because as I mentioned, you do have a bit of access to the source code, but what can be also really useful is if you're interested in building plugins yourself, I think you can learn so much from the open source plugins. It's how I started. back a couple of years ago, just looking at the open source plugins that were out there, messing around with them, changing a few things. So I think that's a really kind of underrated way of learning how to build plugins yourself. What about when people basically want to give it away for free, but they want to protect the code? Stop someone else in charging $10 for your work. Yeah, that is definitely a bit of an issue. Um, I think what I found is that if someone forks your code and they're charging, $10 a month for something that is free, in my experience, they never catch on because number one, the developer, they're not committed to it. They're just not very ethical, first of all. I think the community does a good job of calling those people out. So I'll agree that it is a risk, but I think that the difference between a well-supported open source plugin, and when I say well-supported, I mean the community, versus someone who's just looking for a quick buck, I think in the medium and at least the long term, that open source plugin is going to win out and people aren't going to value the one that's been ripped off. Just in case you're not aware, so you can actually see the source code of all open source plugins by just clicking this C plugin code on some of the plugins. Really useful things to do, like I said. And then one last point. So I've kind of gone through reviews, gone through things like, active forum threads, plugin demo pages. Like there's so many plugins out there that don't actually show you how to use it. They might have like 3 or 4 bullet points on this is how you use it. But for me, there's nothing like having an actual demo page that people can see the plugin in action. And then even better again, if they have an editor that is public, so the users can actually see the workflow actions behind it. I think this is like just chef's kiss, this kind of plugin here. So this is from Lola from Lunch Pail Labs, who I really kind of rate highly as a plugin developer. And you can see they've talked about what the plugin does. They've also given a live demo and a demo editor. Again, at most of the top of in most of the Cranford Tech plugin demos, you're actually going to have a banner at the top that says, click here to view editor. And then I make the editor viewable for everyone, just so you can see what's going on underneath the hood. So that's it. That's really all I wanted to talk about with Bubble plugins. If anyone has any other questions, let me know. Thanks so much for listening. If you ever have any thoughts about plugins or just want to chat, feel free to ping me a message and I'd be more than happy to chat. But that's kind of a high level overview of how I think about the Bubble plugins marketplace and some of the things to look out for, and then more importantly, some of the red flags to avoid. And sorry, Eugenia, you had a good question there. How do you know about plugins are going to be maintained? Yeah, that's it's always the issue. So paid plugins, the developer obviously has an incentive to maintain them. Free ones, it's a bit more of a black box. You don't really know, but at least you have access to the source code. But yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Oh, one more from Sebastian. Is it possible to prevent an end user from seeing that we have used a plugin? For example, if I want to use Google Form, this is a good question. And something I've actually only become aware of recently, Sebastian, is that if your Bubble app is live, pretty much anyone can see the plugins that are being used. It's not the easiest thing to do. You need to know how to dig around and actually figure it out. But I can figure out, if I was so inclined, every single plugin that's been used in a particular app. Can you go deeper into how we can learn about developing and understanding plugins? Yeah, so my advice here isn't going to be revolutionary, but honestly, the best way to do it is simply to build something yourself. I would recommend starting off with something simple, maybe like a modified version of a current open source plugin, and then maybe use ChatGPT, maybe use Claude to modify it slightly to suit your needs. Other stuff that's interesting, I know the guys from Minimum Studio, they're coming out with a Bubble plugin course over the next few months, I think. I'd recommend that because they've made some fantastic plugins in the past, and I've no doubt that that'll be of a pretty high quality. But the sad truth is there actually isn't that many resources out there on how to build high quality plugins. So I guess from a positive point of view, there's less competition. It's still pretty young, but it does take a bit of messing around to figure things out when you're just starting off for the first time. So I hope that helps, Eugenio. Brilliant. Well, listen, thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you have any other questions, feel free to follow up with me afterwards. I'm on the Bubble forum. But it's been a pleasure, and thanks again for all your questions.